You're listening to the Sex Addicts Recovery Podcast, a place for sex addicts to share their experiences of recovery, to help break the stigma, myths, and misconceptions of sex addiction. This podcast may contain topics of sexuality, sexual trauma, dysfunction, or other things that may be triggering, so listener discretion is advised. Hello, and welcome to the Sex Addicts Recovery Podcast. My name is Jason, I'm a sex addict, and I will be your podcast host for today. What's going on, everybody? Welcome to episode number 86 of the Sex Addicts Recovery Podcast. This week, I'm excited to share part 2 of our tradition study, and once again, Darren F. will be leading the discussion with a few fellows from the Taking Action group, which is an SAA meeting based in McKinney, Texas. Back in episode 81, we discussed the history of the traditions as well as the first 3 traditions. And since we didn't finish tradition 3, we will be picking up there and continuing on with 4, 5, and 6. During our discussion on Tradition 6, I was hoping to talk about a certain aspect of it, but didn't quite get to it, so I thought I would read part of Tradition 6 from the Green Book and talk about it here in the intro of this episode. And this comes from the bottom of page 86, and a reminder that Tradition 6 is: an SAA group ought never endorse, finance, or lend the SAA name to any related facility or outside enterprise, lest problems of money, property, and prestige divert us from our primary purpose. And this is the bottom paragraph of page 86. The sixth tradition wisely identifies money, property, and prestige as potential obstacles to effectively carrying our message of recovery. Our efforts as a fellowship are based on the spiritual principle of service, rather than on self-interest or desire for gain. Money and property are powerful forces in the world, and when we are tempted to affiliate ourselves with an outside enterprise, these forces almost always play a part, diverting energy and attention from our focus on helping the suffering sex addict, or even damaging the integrity of our service structure. We need to remember that our purpose is not to make money, nor even grow as an organization. SAA's growth and financial stability are only instruments helping us carry our message. They must always be secondary to that purpose, never ends in themselves. So I wanted to talk about the podcast and how Tradition 6 comes into play. And if you listen to a lot of podcasts like I do, you're probably familiar with promos and ads. Many podcasts are used as a way to make money by selling advertising, and I've received quite a few emails about wanting to advertise or sponsor the podcast, and even some looking at ways of growing our opportunities to make money. We're just focused on carrying the message of SAA to other suffering sex addicts and to inform the public about our program. The Bay Area Intergroup has a budget for PI CPC projects, and by the way, I've talked about that, which is public information and cooperation with the professional community, with Darren on episode number 65. Anyway, we have the money budgeted for the podcast, so we don't have to raise money with ads affiliating SAA with outside enterprises. In that way, we're not diverting our focus away from carrying the message. So I was going to bring this up in our conversation, but I didn't quite feel that it fit the flow. So anyway, with all that said, I am now ready to turn it over to our conversation. Here it is. I hope you enjoy it. All right. I'm so excited to finally be able to continue our tradition study. We have Darren, who's going to be leading this again. And last time we did traditions 1, 2, and 3, and also we did an introduction to what the traditions were all about, kind of the history behind the traditions. And we didn't finish up Tradition 3 on the last recording, so we're going to pick up from there and cover Traditions 4, 5, and 6 in this episode, and then we'll continue to tackle 3 traditions at a time and do a couple more episodes that will be coming out later in the year. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Darren, and he'll introduce who's here on the call, and then we'll jump into Tradition 3.
Thanks, Jason. Darren, I'm so grateful to be back on the podcast and to continue our traditions study over a couple of podcasts here. So again, my name Darren F. recovered sex addict from McKinney, Texas. Been in Sex Addicts Anonymous since November of 2010, and my home group is the Taking Action Group of McKinney, Texas. And I'll ask us Ted S. to introduce himself. Who was not on the first podcast, but glad you're here now, Ted.
Thanks, Darren. Ted S., a recovered sex addict. My home group is the Taking Action Group of McKinney in McKinney, Texas. I walked in May of 2019, and my sobriety date is June 15th of 2020.
Thanks, Ted. And our friend from across the pond, Bob D.
Hi, Darren. Yeah, Bob D., recovered sex addict, based in McKinney, Texas, a Taken Action Group. I've been in the program for 5 years now. My sobriety, 3 years sober, my sobriety date is the 20th of January, 2020. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Bob. And now we'll go up to Scott R.
Yep, Scott R. from Taking Action Group, and I've been involved with the SAA since October of 2015.
Thanks, Scott. Eric M.
Yes, my name is Eric M. I am also from McKinney Tag. I joined the group in June of 2017, and I'm just glad to be here this evening.
Great to see you, Eric. And Taylor.
My name is Taylor. I'm a sex addict. I'm glad to be here. My sobriety date is November 15th of last year, and I think I got invited to this call from my AA experience. And I've been in AA for a little over 10 years.
Yeah,
nice.
Glad you're here. We get everybody. And Jason T, as always. So, yeah, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of finish up some loose ends on Tradition 3. And can I get a volunteer to read the short form and the long form of Tradition 3?
Sure, I'll read it.
Thanks, Bob.
The long form, our SAA experience has taught us that our membership ought to include all who suffer from sex addiction. Hence, we may refuse none who wish to recover, nor ought SAA membership ever depend on money or conformity. Any 2 or 3 sex addicts gathering together for sobriety may call themselves an SAA group, provided that as a group they have no other affiliation. In the short version, the only requirement for SAA membership is a desire to stop acting out.
Thanks, Bob. So just a reminder, the SAA Traditions used the short form in our publication, the Green Book. The long form was not really because of the copyright issues. No other 12-step fellowship publishes the long form. Other traditions, but we can get a lot of useful information by reading it and studying them. And the SAA third tradition says a desire to stop addictive sexual behavior. Let's see. So we finished off, again, this tradition reminds me of who's an SAA member and what is an SAA group. And one of the things we wanted to continue to talk about was something that comes to mind on page, what is it? Page 140 of the 12 and 12. So some of the material that we're referencing is again, the long and the short that can be found in the back of the 12 and 12. We're going to reference the Green Book from time to time, the Big Book from time to time. But so on page 140 of the 12 and 12 for this tradition, it talks about, it says we cater only to pure and respectable addicts. So, back when the 12 steps were first getting going in these meetings, these alcoholics were getting together, they started to realize that some different kind of cats were coming into their meetings, and they're like, are we okay with that? And I'm reminded that sometimes that happens in Sex Addicts Anonymous. We get a variety of folks who come in, who act out different, who behave different, who think different, who look different. And are we willing to accept everybody if they have a desire to stop addictive sexual behavior? This tradition says yes. But I'd love to hear your experience on that, because sometimes it does come up in a group or a group conscience where they're like, "What about that person?" So what have you all experienced in terms of membership in our fellowship? Have you seen this being an issue?
I'll jump in with that. One of the things that came up for me in my local home group, and this was something that the ISO had sent out an email around, was looking at minors coming to meetings, anyone under the age of 18. And they left that up to the individual meetings to assess. And we looked at the traditions and we looked at some legal aspects, but it kept coming down to tradition 3 for my home meeting, and saying that anyone is welcome as long as they have a desire to stop addictive sexual behavior. And we have had a few 17-year-olds come in and been okay with that. But there's been other times when other meetings where someone has felt uncomfortable with a certain type of acting out, and do they belong in this meeting? And I keep pointing them back to tradition 3. Said yes, they are welcome at this meeting.
Right. Yeah, they want to stop. Do they want to stop? Yeah, welcome. Here's a chair.
Yeah.
I love the ease of entry into our fellowship. It seems to me this tradition was kind of born in fear. Oh my gosh, what if we let certain people in our meetings? What people think, how would they affect the meeting? How would they affect us? And thank goodness for a spiritual program which allowed those initial members to realize that, hey, we don't need to be afraid. Whoever those people are or that person is, they're not powerful enough to impact us or to destroy us, right? What else jumps out at you in the 12 and 12 text, folks? Anything jumping out?
Eric, recovered sex addict. So I know meetings have different formats, and some meetings are specific to certain genders. And I don't think this tradition is saying that we're being exclusionary. It's saying the only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking. Well, if there's a men's meeting and there's a men's meeting because the group conscious has decided it's a men's meeting, then it's a men's meeting. But if a woman contacts that meeting and is looking for help, we're not going to just say, hey, sorry, go find another meeting. We're going to help them find another meeting. We're going to help them find a resource. Just as if, there was somebody that was going, there was a women's meeting and a male wanted to go to that meeting. The only requirement is the desire. And that's SAA as a whole. But I think it's fully valid for meetings to have, group consciousness to decide, for the safety of our members and for the safety of their spouses, this is going to be a men's only or a women's only meeting.
Thanks, Eric.
I'll add a comment too. Oh,
sorry, go on.
did you want to go ahead, Bob?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, in 12 and 12 on 141, it talks about how a last experience taught us that to take away any alcoholic, or in our case, sex addict's full chance, was sometimes to pronounce his death sentence. And it just reminds me, it's not my place to judge. If a guy's in the room, he didn't come because he's having a good day. He came because he's struggling, right? And he's in a tough spot. And it's not my role to be the judge. Can I ask him questions to help him figure out, is he a sex addict? Absolutely. But it's not my role to be the judge or to try to guess which guy has the best chance of finding recovery, right? God's the one that's going to do that work, our higher power, not me.
Yeah, my comment was along the similar lines, actually, about being judgmental. Because, is that person coming into the fellowship for the first time? Are they a sex addict or are they a heavy user? It doesn't matter. we won't judge. We recovered or whatever. It's the decision's down to them. We'll give them the program and the way it works, but they'll have to decide themselves. We'll never do that. So I think the whole thing about being non-judgmental is absolutely key. And just to encourage people to come in. If you're in doubt, come on in. We want to see if you want to stop, come on in. Yeah, thanks.
I'm reminded that it takes all of us in Sex Addicts Anonymous to carry this message, and we're a much stronger fellowship as a result of this tradition being so inclusive, right?
Yeah.
If we just needed a certain type of sex addict, man, we're not going to be as effective as we could. And I love what it says on 142. What were they really afraid of? Well, they were afraid of their reputation, right? We're more afraid of what people might say than the trouble that the strange addict might bring. They ask themselves, what would the master do? I love that question, right? That takes me back to tradition 2 and who's in charge of the group. Well, our higher power is in charge of the group, right? So we need to bring these issues to our higher power, and the folks who authored these traditions back in 1950, they were aware of that, and they said, well, it's simple. I'll let them in. Do they want to stop using? Do they want to stop acting out? Welcome to Sex Addicts Anonymous. And here's a chair. We need you. How many of us felt that no one needed you, right? until you came to Sex Addicts Anonymous. Oh my gosh, you need me, really? You know what I did, right? And you're saying you need me? Yeah, welcome. All right. How cool is that?
It's good to be needed.
Right, feels good. So they talk about express a desire. Let's see. Anyone's welcome who has a desire to stop. How do we express a desire to stop? I know our Green Book talks about the no one can judge your desire, but practically speaking, there's certain things that we do in Sex Addicts Anonymous to express that desire to stop. What are some of those things that would express that desire? Is it just coming to a meeting and sitting in a chair?
Getting a sponsor and working the steps.
Right. Getting a sponsor, followed rapidly by starting the steps. What else?
Well, I guess part of the same thing, but it's a willingness to work. And we talk about in the step work about, the drowning man and, someone who's literally desperate, going to grab that life raft. And again, we won't judge on it, of course, but it's got to be a desire to work, not come to meetings. It's to actually do the work and just be keen on that.
Yeah. So it sounds like to me that a healthy Sex Addicts Anonymous meeting, if we're trying to honor these traditions, the majority of the people that are attending that meeting would have a sponsor, would be working the steps, and if the majority of the folks that are doing are in the meeting that are doing that, the stronger the meeting is going to be. The less confusing it'll be for the newcomer who shows up. Okay, I guess I get a sponsor. Okay, I guess I work these 12 steps, and but unfortunately that's not always the case, right? So we use these traditions to guide our activity while we're in our meetings.
Hey, Darren, Ted, I'm thinking about that term of, the willingness and the healthiness of the group. The health of the group is also willingness to sponsor, right? The willingness to give away what you've been given, the gift that you've been given. If somebody comes into the room and there's no sponsors, that's a problem. That's an unhealthy group, right? Where does that person go? Well, thanks for showing up, but I guess this group isn't for me. But at the appropriate time in the meeting, when several people put their hand in the air as a willingness to sponsor that individual, that's a healthy group. People that have worked the steps, had a spiritual awakening as a result of working the steps, and then that willingness to give it to the man that's still suffering. It's key.
Yeah, it is. And if your group doesn't have any sponsors, well, I hope your group has some resources that can direct the new person to get one somehow. But some meetings are blessed, have a bunch. Some meetings may not so much. But yeah, it talks. So later on the tradition, it talks about what a group is, right? So a group is two or more people meeting together for the purpose of recovery. So what does it look like meeting for the purpose of recovery? What are
Well,
characteristics maybe of a healthy, strong meeting that's meeting for that purpose?
I think one of the characteristics is just simply studying the text and
The solution.
understanding, what the precise instructions are, versus sharing war stories, for lack of a better term. I think the ability in our group, of course, we spend time in the book, reading the instructions around the 12 steps, and then sharing our experience with them. And it's not in working the 12 steps. And there's a ton of insight that comes from the group. I'm reminded too, in SAA, everyone's template in terms of their particular ways they've acted out look different. And by the way, the role of the internet has played a lot, has changed a lot, what's happening in the world of sex addiction and the accessibility of it. And, traditionally, guys in SAA usually came from some sort of sexual abuse or other abuses as a child. But if you go look at it now, it could be any sort of they could come from a lot of different places, especially online. And that sort of experience seen through the lens of the 12 steps and people sharing that is important. And I think it helps the new guy be able to connect with other guys. Hey, this guy understands what I've been through. He's worked the steps. He can show me what he did. I want what he has. Right. And that all comes from a healthy group that's studying the steps.
And the reason that's important, when somebody comes in the room and we're talking about the solution rather than our past, is hope, right? If that guy can do it, and maybe there's hope for me, that was extremely important for me to see a room full of men pursuing a higher power, pursuing recovery, being honest, open-minded, and willing. And it gave me a lot of hope in those early days when I didn't have much, and I was standing on the shoulders of those men. That's extremely important. Hope.
Yeah, absolutely. Back in Tradition 1, we talked about unity, and the main thing that we're unified behind is the common solution, more so than the problem, right? So when we meet together for the purpose of recovery, it sounds like we ought to be talking about how can I recover? How can I use these 12 steps to get from a hopeless state of mind and body to a recovered sex addict as fast as possible, because I'm dying and I hate it. So let's move into some common pitfalls, and we'll jump into 4. We've talked about some of those things, again, like being judgmental when people come in the door, how they acted out. I don't know. I don't want to associate with that person or those people, or I'm not sure they're a sex addict. They say they are, but I don't think they are, and treating them different, or some things that come to mind. Coming to Sex Addicts Anonymous, treating other problems other than my sex addiction is a pitfall. I have a desire to stop acting out. Well, I also have a desire to treat my wife better, to be a better boss or a better employee, to be a better friend, to not be a workaholic, to minimize my drinking. If I'm coming to Sex Addicts Anonymous to try to treat other things, I have to be careful of that, right? And strong members of the group need to remind those members who are maybe talking about other things, trying to treat or fix other problems, maybe where they can go to better do that, because Sex Addicts Anonymous treats sex addicts who have a desire to stop addictive sexual behavior. Any other pitfalls or ways that we might not practice this tradition very well come to mind?
Yeah, one for me is on a spiritual side. It's very much a spiritual based program, but not a religious one. So, we in our local group, we make a big point of saying it doesn't matter if it's a church with a spire, if it's a mosque, if it's mob from the moon. It really doesn't matter. It's whoever is who you believe is that power that you don't have within yourself. So I think there is a danger that we fall in the trap of a religious based program, which is absolutely not. So I think that's one of the pitfalls we have to avoid.
Yeah, that'll come up in Tradition 10 with outside issues and some other things. Let's see what else comes to mind. I'm reminded that we need to be welcoming to every person who walks in the door as best we can. Is our presence, is our meeting, is what we're doing, is how we're introducing ourselves, how the conduct of our meeting, is it welcoming for all, regardless of who's there, because it's so important, right? We have an attractive program. Is our sobriety attractive to the newcomer? And if it's not, we need to challenge ourselves and the group on what we can do better. Maybe we need to do a tradition inventory at the group level to figure out how we can be more welcoming, less judgmental to the newcomer. I love standing at the door when people come in. Hey, do you have a desire to stop acting out? they all say yes. I've never met one that says no. I wouldn't let them in if they said no, right? But we also have a dog that sniffs for that willingness. It's our little mascot for the meeting, willingness sniffing dog. All right, let's move on to tradition 4. Can I get a volunteer to read the long and the 4 of 4?
Yeah, I'll read it.
I can read it. Oh, go ahead, Taylor.
Tradition 4, with respect to its own affairs, each SAA group should be responsible to no other authority than its own conscience. But when its plans concern the welfare of neighboring groups also, those groups ought to be consulted. And no group, regional committee, or individual should ever take any action that might greatly affect SAA as a whole without conferring with the trustees of the General Service Board. On such issues, our common welfare is paramount. The short form. Each group ought to be autonomous except in matters affecting other groups or SAA as a whole.
Thanks, Taylor. Just as a reminder, one of the ways that SAA changed or would have changed the long form would be to use the word International Service Organization as opposed to
General Service Board.
General Service Board, right? So our structure is slightly different, but we get the idea. So here we start to see a couple of themes repeating themselves that we found in 1 and 2. So we see a lot of repetition throughout the traditions with the various principles. And again, I'm reminded that SAA, we wouldn't have this tradition, or we wouldn't have needed this tradition if we didn't have our issues, right? If our actions, because there are times that we take actions, whether it's on purpose or accidentally, that could harm other groups or SAA as a whole. And fortunately, we have this tradition for us to course correct when we find ourselves in that situation. So it's not necessarily about, oh my God, we got to totally avoid it. But this tradition here is just to remind us that, hey, we need to be careful and mindful and look at some of the ways that our attitudes, our opinions, are the things that we say and the things that we do could potentially impact our fellowship as a whole, which is hard to believe. How can I, as an individual in my little town, impact Sex Addicts Anonymous, this worldwide organization, nonprofit, 2,000 plus groups? Well, we're going to talk about how that might happen. It's not as hard as you think it is. Let's see, page 83 of the Green Book. It says autonomy also means that each group has the freedom to make mistakes and learn from them at its own pace. And I love also what it says in the 12 and 12 and 147. Every group has the right to be wrong. Mm-hmm. So we're going to make mistakes. We're not going to do this thing perfectly. We're going to get judgmental. We're going to get opinionated, and we might say something that could be offensive. So let's look at that. How can so each group should be autonomous except in matters affecting SAA as a whole. I love the freedom that this tradition gives the groups, right? What are some of the freedoms that this tradition gives your home group?
I think this is key for me. I come from a previous group prior to TAG that was a Green Book group, and which was fine, and it was working for the people there. And it was more a group discussion event. So the meetings were not as structured. They weren't so action based. It was more to do with relaying and sharing your experiences in your addiction for the past period. And I say, not knocking that at all. It works for people. I came to TAG for a reason, because it's taken action, and I needed that structure, if you like. So the great thing is, neither side is right or wrong. each group is actually following the book, following the 12 steps, but doing it in their own way and not doing something completely off the ranch, just different strokes. And I know we in TAG, will be the first people to say to someone, well, maybe that group would be a better fit for you, or, somebody could be referred the other way. It doesn't make it right or wrong. It's just a different approach. So I think that's important.
I think the freedom that comes from this tradition allows groups to stay healthy because it allows groups to try new things, right? We have we started an anniversary breakfast this past year. We provided an opportunity for guys that had worked the steps to work the steps again. We just had a sponsorship workshop. We're open to all kinds of ideas. We do a Sunday morning breakfast. We have several different meeting spots where guys get together outside the meeting. And I think this idea of having the freedom to try new things, the reality is if we try something that doesn't work, it usually doesn't last. And so the best ideas take root, and it allows a group to stay healthy.
Yeah, one of the things that I was thinking about was with the freedom to make mistakes is when we took our in-person meetings onto Zoom and trying to experiment with the various things that we could do to either recreate or improve on what our meetings were before, and looking at different formats and different things that we can be doing. And one of the things that I talk about a lot on the podcast, and a lot of the guests have been from my noon meeting, and that meeting has grown so much. And in the early days, we had 20 people on. It was fine. And once we started approaching 50, we talked about the idea of doing breakout rooms. And at first, the breakout rooms that we assigned, there were too few people. And so a majority of the meeting was people just kind of staring at each other without much to say. And then we made the decision not to do that. And then the meeting expanded even again. So right now, currently, we're about 85 to 120 people. And so we've got dedicated size of breakout rooms. And that has come over time through experimentation, trying to figure out what works and what doesn't. And that freedom to make a mistake and say, hey, that didn't work. Let's try something different next month. And just constantly reevaluating how to better serve everyone. And we also make room for newcomers, anyone with a burning desire, share at the end. And our fellowship afterwards, we dedicate the first couple minutes to people that are brand new to the program or have questions about SAA or the program. And those types of things have happened through experimentation. And without that freedom to make those mistakes, we wouldn't have learned what works and what doesn't.
Yeah, that's a great example, Jason. I remember, we're in Texas. And so when we came back, we started coming back earlier than a lot of the country did. And we started talking about how do we do this, right? And we started the hybrid meeting. I was not at all convinced we could pull this thing off with this, new gadget called an owl, and we could do in-room people and online. And I was totally proven wrong, right? It's allowed our group to grow in ways that I would have never imagined. And it's just another reminder for me that I'm not in control, right? That's a good thing. And so just keeping an open mind and allowing groups to test and try new things is great.
Yeah. There's over 2,100 SAA meetings, right? And each one's unique. Each one is autonomous. Thank goodness that the board of trustees aren't sitting together meeting on a weekly basis, dictating how we need to run our meetings. They don't need to do that. And so they give us these traditions, give us as individuals in a meeting based on our group conscience and guided by our higher power, what to do, what book to read, how to read it, how to conduct it, what kind of meetings to have, and that's why there's more than one SAA meeting, because what works for some doesn't work for others. Fine. If you don't love your home group, I always tell people, get a different home group, right? If your home group's not the best, go find a different group. I love my home group, right? It works for me. Yes, but there are ways that we can kind of screw this up for sex addicts coming into SAA and SAA as a whole to give SAA maybe a bad rap or a bad reputation or cause confusion. And this is all about really for the newcomer. That we want to minimize confusion for the newcomer during our meetings. And so hopefully our meetings are all about the 12 steps, honoring the traditions, talking about recovery, meeting for the purpose of recovery. We're all sex addicts, but kind of the ins and outs and the hows that we do that meeting are kind of open and roomy. One thing that, in terms of pitfalls, one thing that can create problems for our fellowship is me expressing opinion that could potentially be confusing for the newcomer, right? And one of the ways I can do that is by bad mouthing or gossiping in a negative way about other meetings, other types of meetings, other different types of literature, different approaches to working the steps, right? Has anyone ever heard those types of things? It doesn't make you feel good, does it?
No, not at all.
And it's not an attractive feature. If someone were to come to your meeting, all of a sudden you're talking about other things in a negative light. It's like, what is SAA? I guess SAA is against this and against that and not for that. And that will get the attention of people because those newcomers can call SAA. There's a number that you can call the Houston office, talk to the ISO office, talk to the director, talk to the board of trustees and go, hey, did you hear about what this meeting in McKinney, Texas is doing? Or in Houston, Texas, or in Minneapolis, or in San Jose. They said that therapy is not good. They said that you can't go see a therapist. They said that you need to not read that book or you have to read this book.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And does that put SAA in a good light or a bad light?
Bad.
Opinionated.
Yeah. It gets the attention of people. We don't need that kind of attention. We're a place to recover. So let's be autonomous. We can do what we want, except when it might affect other SAA meetings or SAA as a whole. What other gotchas come to mind or pitfalls with this tradition that you've all experienced?
I wanted to jump in with one that just happened this week. And it wasn't something that happened in our meeting, but someone during our fellowship brought this up as a question. He was attending an SAA meeting where the secretary was reading the script from another S fellowship. And he was wondering if that was okay. And I was like, there's something in the traditions. I was like searching all over the books. And in prep for this recording here, I found this passage at the bottom of page 83. Our meetings are to be identifiable as SAA meetings, clearly following and presenting the steps and traditions of SAA as written, bearing our name and no other, and offering hope to all who seek recovery from sexual addiction. And so one of the things that causes confusion is if multiple fellowships are represented in one meeting and trying to figure out, is this an SAA meeting or is it another fellowship? And that did cause confusion. So, I answered that today at our meeting, and hopefully that guy will be able to bring that to a group conscience to that other meeting and say, hey, the tradition says this. So that was one of the things that I thought about. The other another aspect of that is when we start to talk about other types of therapy, other types of things that are outside the realms of 12-step recovery. And does that mean we're endorsing that? Or does that mean when we talk about doing therapeutic disclosures, that is not part of the 12 steps. A lot of people in SAA do a disclosure with their partner with the work of a therapist, but that is outside of the realm of SAA. And I usually try to let people know, hey, we're focused on this program. If you would like to talk about that in fellowship, fine. But for this meeting, we're going to be focused on our program.
I love that. I love that, Jason. I think I think it's important when you're in a meeting, you focus on the steps and the solution. With your sponsor, you can have those conversations in fellowship. You can talk about that kind of stuff one-on-one in smaller groups. That's okay. But I think that's huge. Another pitfall I see is, this idea of autonomy as a home group and kind of call it navel gazing, kind of staring and focusing in on just your home group limits the group's ability to be of service beyond just the group, maybe at the intergroup level, the area level, the ISO level. I think that autonomy can be almost something we hide behind as to why we don't serve at the next level and get connected to other groups, which to me is a shame, because you're depriving your group from, I think, a real opportunity to grow and see more ideas that are out there from other groups too.
Yeah. Not honoring the group's conscience, right? The group conscious decisions. Hey, the group says we're going to do one thing, and all of a sudden the people in the meeting are doing something else. It says we should be responsible to no other authority other than our own conscience. So if we're saying one thing and doing another, that creates a problem. It creates confusion, and we don't need to create more. It's already hard enough, right? We don't need complicated. I love what it says in the 12 and 12 on 149. It's rule 62, right? What does rule 62 say? Hey, let's not take ourselves so damn seriously. This is supposed to be fun. It's a fatal progressive disease, but we can have fun because we have a solution. We offer a solution. So let's talk about the solution. Let's work toward the solution, and let's keep it simple. It's not overcomplicated with rules, regulations, a whole bunch of lists of things you need to do to belong. Let's just honor these traditions. Keep it simple. What else? I think it's time to probably move on to number 5.
If I may, Darren, before we close this one.
Yes, sir. Taylor.
Yeah, I think Jason brought up a good point about, he took responsibility to course correct a member who wasn't following the group conscious with things, related to disclosure and whatnot. And then, and I think a pitfall that I see a lot is that we have a belief that our way is right, and a lot of groups have that belief. That whether it's a big book meeting or a green book meeting or a meditation meeting, they have this idea that, we're the ones looking at recovery and this is how it needs to be done. And I think even in this call, even in this podcast, a few times we've talked about things like, well, it needs to be focused in this direction or it needs to be focused in that direction. Really what I see in this tradition is it says, in fact, if they believe that disclosure is something that is recovery based in their meeting, and that's part of their group conscious, they have every right to do that. Will it be successful? I don't know. What's beautiful about this tradition is that if you're doing things that don't work, eventually your members all die off. They don't. These programs, especially in AA, you look at if the things that they're doing don't work, the membership declines very quickly. In SAA, it's the same thing. So we just let them do it. I don't have to judge. I don't have to say that they're doing it wrong. If they want to do disclosures or other things that aren't really 12-step based, and that's their group conscious, they have every right to do that. That's what I wanted to pop in there.
Thanks, Taylor. Page 146 of the 12 and 12, it says that we saw that the group, exactly like the individual, must eventually conform to whatever tested principles will guarantee survival, right? So there are some tested principles that guarantee survival. And so it sounds like if we start to veer off of the tested principles that guarantee it, we're kind of in this land of, I don't know, will it work? Will it not? And so some meetings fail, some meetings succeed. And we need to not get too wrapped up into what they're doing. It's kind of none of my business. If it's not my home group, it's certainly none of my business. If it's my home group, I've got a voice in that home group, and we can talk. So, yeah. Number 5, who wants to read the long and short of Tradition 5?
I'll read it. Our SAA experience has taught us that each SAA group ought to be a spiritual entity having but one primary purpose, that of carrying its message to the addict who still suffers. And the short form, each group has but one primary purpose, to carry its message to the addict who still suffers.
Thanks, Ted. This tradition suggests that we have one job in SAA. It suggests that we should try to do one thing well instead of many things poorly, right? The Green Book on page 85, it says this purpose is central to everything we do as a fellowship. I'd love to dissect the long form for a second because it talks about each group ought to be a spiritual entity. Well, what does that look like? Is my home group, is your home group a spiritual entity? And how do I know? What do we do to make it a spiritual entity? What comes up for y'all when you read that? What are some qualities of a spiritual entity? Silence. I love it.
I'll touch on it.
Stump the panel. I love it.
Well, in tradition two, we have a group conscious, and if we're following a group conscious, then I would consider it a spiritual entity in general. Now, there's evidence of spirituality through levity, and we read this in earlier where people are talking about spiritual topics, and I think that can be evident. But if you're following a group conscious where we're using the group to make decisions on behalf of or make decisions for the good of our community, then I think that would be considered a spiritual entity.
Yeah. I appreciate you bringing up number tradition two, right? We talked about the group conscience and being directed by a loving God, right? The group's directed by a loving God, but how do the individuals get connected to a God of their understanding? We talked about how working the 12 steps gets the individuals connected spiritually, ideally, right? That's the hope. And so it sounds like maybe a spiritual entity or a group might have the majority of its members actively seeking this power via a 12-step program. Sex Addicts Anonymous is a 12-step program last time I checked. So, I think a spiritual entity or a group might be more likely to be a spiritual entity if the majority of its members are seeking God via our suggested method, right? You betcha. What else is in the long form? So each group ought to be a spiritual entity having but one primary purpose, that of carrying its message to the sex addict who still suffers. I don't know about you all, but I see this as probably one of the most important traditions. I hate to editorialize on one being more important than the other. It's all important, but the authors, if you're to look at how they wrote this, they used italics to emphasize something, right? If you ever see italics in a book, it means pay attention because we had to change the type font, right? And back in the day, they had to take the little things off and put the italic one on, and except, we didn't have Word back then. So they had to change the type font, and they also redundantly stated something here. And I know the authors of the book, the original book, didn't like to redundantly state anything unless it was really important. So it says we have but one primary, kind of the same thing, purpose, that of carrying its message to the sex addict who still suffers. That begs the question that I'm going to ask the panel: what is our message?
Excuse me, sorry.
It's just a fun exercise to do at the group level during your next business meeting. Go, all right, here's an index card. I want everybody who's here to write down the message that we're carrying.
I know what my answer is.
Okay, Jason's got an answer. Anybody else have an answer they want to share maybe later? Well, I think Scott raising his hand. Ted, Jason, what's the message that we're carrying?
That recovery is possible through working the 12 steps of Sex Addicts Anonymous.
What page is that on?
I have no idea.
Page 84, that freedom from addictive sexual behavior is possible.
Oh, nice.
12 steps of SAA. Right. That's a good, it says it's possible through the 12 steps. What else? Scott or Ted?
I was always taught by my sponsor that, the solution really sits in, the first 11 words of the 12 steps, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of working the steps. And that's really what it's about.
Right. I always say we got 11-word message. I had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps. And which falls in line with what the Green Book says there on 84. The steps are the solution, right? The spiritual awakening is the solution. How are you sober today, Darren? The newcomer comes up to me and asks me, I get a chip. Hey, and the group says, how did you do it? And oftentimes you hear a lot of different things, right? If you've been to various meetings, you can hear some interesting things. I like to say how I did it exactly. I had a spiritual awakening as a result of the 12 steps. It's clear, it's concise, it's the truth in my experience. If I'm in a 12-step meeting, that's how I recovered. That's, all credit goes to that power. How did I get connected to that power? Via the 12 steps. It's not the 12 steps and something else, right? If I'm in an SAA meeting, it's the SAA 12 steps. That can be
There's
kind of
no dot,
controversial.
dot in the text. Yeah.
Because you hear lots of
Just the
things.
12.
Have you ever heard some interesting things when someone asks, "Hey, how did you do it? How are you sober for 9 months? How are you sober?"
One day at a time. That's what I hear.
Right. I prayed a lot.
Yeah,
I went to
or
a lot
by
of
the-
meetings.
Yeah.
Yeah, lots of different things. But so I think there's unity to that, right? That if I have one purpose, which is to carry the SAA message to the addict who still suffers, I ought to know what the message is, at least be kind of clear on what that is, because we only got one message. We got one purpose and one message. What else comes to mind from that tradition?
I think this is a tradition that looks like it's also kind of an instruction for why do I come to these groups? Am I going for the intention of taking the message to the suffering addict, or do I believe that that I'm going to this meeting so that I can save myself? And I think there's some, if the group intention is we come here so that we can, and it talks about this in the AA book of the groups are meant for new people to find us, and I think sometimes it gets, and this isn't to judge a group or say one is right or wrong, that it gets to when I'm working with addicts, they'll believe that I go to these meetings as the solution and not as an opportunity to carry the solution.
Right. We can hear about the solution at a meeting, and if we're going to a meeting where they're not talking about the solution, that could be kind of confusing. Ideally, the solution that I'm hearing in the meeting lines up with this purpose or lines up with our message. Because if the message that the meeting is carrying is different than what's described in the literature, that can create confusion for the newcomer. Oh, I guess I have to go to 90 meetings in 90 days to recover. That's not our message. It might be a good thing. Oh, I hear about therapy. I guess I have to go to therapy to recover. Well, it could be a good thing. I don't know, but it's not the SAA message, right? The SAA message is, I had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, and I can show you how I did that, to recover. You want to do it? I'll be happy to show you. That's all we're here to do. Everything that a group does. Hey, we're planning a retreat. Okay, that's cool. Is that going to help us carry the message or not? Hey, we're going bowling on Friday night. Every Friday night we're going to go bowling, and every Tuesday morning we're going to have breakfast. And we could do a bunch of things, but we got to be mindful: is this helping us or not? Are we wasting time? Are we spending time doing things that can distract us from this message? Our traditions always guide us back to, hey, don't get distracted by all this other stuff. Let's focus on this, our primary purpose, that of carrying the message to the sex addict. And I love how it says to the sex addict. It's a very proactive, action-based type of thing. I don't wait for them to come to me. I go to them. All right. Any pitfalls from this tradition?
This
Move on
is
to number 6.
Yeah, this is another one that came up this week during our fellowship when we were answering questions. Actually, I got private messaged in the Zoom chat in one of the other breakout rooms. The message was getting off topic, where someone had found a solution that really worked for him, and more power to him. That's awesome. He's working with doctors and got a medication that's really helped curb his sexual desires and wanting to act out. And he wanted to tell everyone about it. And it's like, fantastic. That's great. It doesn't belong in this meeting. And so this is again, when I was studying up this morning, read this from page 85 in the Green Book. Keeping to our primary purpose also means avoiding carrying any message other than our own, and that individuals are free to find things that work outside of our fellowship, and that's fine and dandy. But I had brought this up in the previous tradition as well. But for the time that we are in an SAA meeting, we should be carrying the message of Sex Addicts Anonymous and not this therapist or this type of new drug that helps something, or this recovery center or something like that.
Yeah.
That we should be focused on SAA's message.
Yeah, it's so important. It just keeps it simple for the newcomer. We talked about earlier in the podcast that it's all about the newcomer. Our heart should bleed for that person. Every time the door opens to the meeting, my head moves over. Hey, is that someone new? I hope it's someone new. Because again, if I'm there for me, I'm there for the wrong reasons. I need to work a step with my sponsor and bring a solution to the meeting.
The precious, and it says on 151, the precious gift of sobriety is giving it away. We can't keep it for ourselves. And, we're unified around that. There's unity in our group, and we're unified around carrying that message and being proactive about carrying that message. And once I've had that spiritual awakening, I have to go give it away. My next role is to find that new man to sponsor. I can't keep that for myself. Otherwise, I'm not helping. I'm not helping the group, and I'm also not helping myself.
And the SA fellowship as a whole, right?
Right.
Right. So let's try to protect the integrity of our purpose and our message. Let's all try to have the same message and keep it simple. And during that 1 hour meeting a week that I'm going to, or 2 hour as a week, let's talk about our purpose, talk about our solution, talk about the steps, and then honor these traditions. Good chance the newcomer might feel some hope. Let's knock out number 6. We'll call it good. Who wants to read 6?
I can read.
It's kind of a long one.
I'll read
Thanks,
it.
Scott.
Tradition 6 from the Green Book reads, an SAA ought never endorse, finance, or lend the SAA name to any related facility or outside enterprise, lest problems of money, property, and prestige divert us from our primary purpose. And then the long form written in the AA Big Book, modified for SAA, says, our SAA experience has taught us that problems of money, property, and authority may easily divert us from our primary spiritual aim. We think, therefore, that any considerable property of genuine use to SAA should be separately incorporated and managed, thus dividing the material from the spiritual. An SAA group as such should never go into business. Secondary aids to SAA, such as clubs or hospitals, which require much property or administration, ought to be incorporated and set apart, that if necessary, they can be freely discarded by the groups. Hence, such facilities ought not to use the SAA name. Their management should be the sole responsibility of those people who financially support them. For clubs, SAA managers are usually preferred, but hospitals, as well as other places of recuperation, ought to be well outside SAA and medically supervised. While an SAA group may cooperate with anyone, such cooperation ought never to go so far as affiliation or endorsement, actual or implied. An SAA group can bind itself to no one.
Thanks, Scott. It's kind of a long one.
I was going to say that's a mouthful.
I love the additional stuff that the long form brings. I'm reminded that Sex Addicts Anonymous doesn't really have that in its literature, so it's nice that we're reminding the listener that there's more information in various places that I can go. Ted, are you raising your hand?
No.
How much money, property, or let's see, kind of facilities do we need to carry the SA message? Do we need a whole lot of money, a fancy place?
As little as possible.
Yeah. Eric, Sex Addict. We need enough to keep the lights on. We need enough to pass the message, right? And for our group, that some of that expense includes technology so that we can do our online meetings and reach addicts all over the world. But we're not putting money in the coffers so that everybody can get an SAA t-shirt, right? It's just enough to where we are able to practice our primary principle of helping the man that's still suffering and nothing more.
Yeah. In my experience, I don't need anything. I need a book. I need to have the experience to share. and maybe over time, like you were mentioning, Eric, yeah, we've bought in some things to help improve our reach, but the bottom line is I don't need much of any of that stuff, and it says that it's actually going to be a distraction to the group. Because if we got a whole bunch of money, it's kind of hard to decide what to use a whole bunch of money for, right? If I got $5, hey, well, let's give the $5 away. If I got $1,000, it's like, oh, hold on, I got some idea, right?
And I love that thought of what would the master do, right? It's that sponsor to protege time, one-on-one with a book, sharing stories, sharing my story of recovery, sharing that story of hope. And look, it's essential to find recovery. It's not going to be me. That individual is going to find recovery in his higher power. That's essential. I'll pass.
Yeah.
Eric, sex addict. When I read the 12 and 12, and I'm reading Tradition 6, I really, this is probably the one that I enjoy the most because it has a history lesson along with it. They didn't just write this tradition because they wanted to make rules and, let's keep money out of it. No, they made these mistakes. They struggled with AA hospitals and getting into legislation in the political arena. They did these things, and those things affected the health of their groups. And so, kind of like what we were saying in an earlier tradition, each group has the right to make its own mistakes and learn from them. And we wouldn't have had this tradition if the early groups hadn't have made those mistakes.
Yeah. Thanks, Eric. A couple of things come to mind. I reminded of on pages 157 of the 12 and 12, it says we can't be all things to all people, nor should we try. We a lot of us are grandiose. We got big ideas. Hey, we found a solution to sex addiction. We probably got a solution to some other things. Let's get involved in a bunch of other things. And this tradition reminds me, no, let's just help sex addicts. Let's just do this one simple thing. Speaks to singleness of purpose. I help sex addicts. I help them work the 12 steps. I don't need a lot of property, money, and prestige, and all this stuff. It's going to distract me. It's asking me to sacrifice that grandioseness in me, that thing that says I could be all things to all people. The other point I wanted to bring up with this tradition where it talks about cooperation, but not affiliation. It says that in the long form, not the short form. But it's a hugely important idea. We cooperate, but we don't affiliate. What does that look like, right? So when dealing with outside agencies, Sex Addicts Anonymous cooperates with just about anybody. We'll cooperate with treatment centers. We'll cooperate with jails. We'll cooperate with therapists. We'll cooperate with professionals. We'll cooperate with faith leaders, churches. Okay, but we don't go so far as to affiliate ourselves with those entities. We need those people. Those people are our friends. Those people are going to recommend potential sex addicts to SAA, to our fellowship, to your meeting. And so we work with those folks. We cooperate with them. But during our meetings, during our hour-long meetings, we don't talk about a certain brand of religion. We don't talk about a certain brand of church or therapy, or because it says actual or implied, right? Via my words, I might imply affiliation that the newcomer hears. If I'm sharing during my SAA meeting about, oh, I went to such and such treatment center, that newcomer hears that, it's like, oh, I guess we go to that treatment center. So we do the 12 steps and that, right? So we got to be careful about what we're sharing in our meeting to minimize the implication or the affiliation with these things. It's also why we don't call ourselves First McKinney SAA group. Well, because that's First McKinney Church. That's where we meet, but we're not affiliated. So we have a different name than the church that we pay rent to meet in, just to minimize the implication that we're affiliated with First McKinney. What else comes to mind with cooperation but not affiliation? Because that's kind of a misunderstood term. Taylor.
Darren, one of the things you talked about was the implied affiliation. If you're in a meeting, you're talking about a treatment center. Specifically, I've also seen the opposite of that, where you're doing work in a treatment center, and you're hosting maybe a group in a treatment center, and you have to be very clear that you aren't affiliated and that the modalities used in that treatment center are not. We're not saying that what they do here is right. What we're saying is that the 12 steps work for your sex addiction, and we can help you if you'd like to do that. But just a subtle difference is that in an actual, when you are in a treatment center doing what we call H&I, it can feel implied, and you have to be very careful to make it clear to the newcomers, because you're going to have a lot of them in there that no, we aren't affiliated with them. We're an outside entity, and we don't have to come here. We're not being paid to be here.
Yeah, it's a great example. In Sex Addicts Anonymous, we need to be doing more of that type of activity and honoring. We can do that by exactly honoring what you said. Let's see.
Darren, what you brought up earlier about not naming your meeting after the church that you meet in. I've had a number of newcomers, including myself, when I went to my first SAA meeting in a church, just thinking that because it's in a church that it is affiliated with that church or that religion. And that was such a huge turnoff for me as an agnostic coming into this program. And several newcomers I hear when they come into a meeting at a church is, does that mean that I need to start going to this church? Nope, they give us a room. That's all that we have. So we're not affiliated with the church, but we do pay them rent for use of this space.
Yeah, it's that should be brought up and talked about and explained at some appropriate time. We pay rent. We're not with them. Should be clear. Keep it simple. Let's see. The bottom line, the thing that bottom lines this for me is on 156 with the 12 and 12, where it says people might become confused about what SAA does if we're affiliating or associating ourselves with other or these outside entities. That's the last thing we want to do. SAA. What does SAA do? We treat sex addiction and something else? No, we just treat sex addiction via the 12 steps. And we're going to separate the spiritual from the material. It's not about money. We ought to be, the tradition says we ought to be readily available to free ourselves from any obligation. We don't sign a 10-year lease, right? Because we might not need to be there. It might be God's will that we need to be somewhere else. We need to be able to freely leave that facility or that location. What else? Common pitfalls. Accidentally implying affiliation when sharing during a meeting. Even bringing up my sponsor almost affiliates with something else, right? Let alone my counselor, my pastor, my priest, my rabbi, my spiritual guru. That implies that, okay, I guess we do SAA and these other things. So just be mindful of that. I think there's so much. One of the best reasons to not talk about that is we have so much else to talk about, right? Aren't the 12 steps enough? If I can't talk about the 12 steps, what am I doing? If I need to talk about something else, maybe I need to be over there instead of an SAA. You probably don't go there and talk about SAA. Why in SAA do I talk about what I'm doing outside of SAA? Kind of funny. Any other pitfalls with this tradition? Not using the power of cooperation to help carry the SAA message comes to mind. There's so much we can do by cooperating. And yet, I think in Sex Addicts Anonymous, we're just scratching the surface of that idea. There's a recent committee that was started a couple of years ago called Public Information and Cooperation with the Professional Community, PICPC. And that committee is designed to help inform our membership about the need to do that, how to do that, why to do that, how can I do that by honoring these traditions. And we've learned a lot from the original fellowship, who's been doing that from day one pretty well. So it helps me to get out of self by talking to those professionals, talking to those other entities, cooperating with those people. If I go talk to a professional, I collect their business cards, but I don't come out and hand them out in my Sex Addicts Anonymous meeting, right? I'm clear to them that, hey, appreciate the cards, but I'm not going to be an advertisement for you. And they get it. Jason, it's been an awesome hour and 15 minutes. I sure appreciate the time to finish up 3 and go into 4, 5, 6. And just as a reminder to the listeners, again, we're not experts. We're trying to present a model for talking about the traditions, teaching the traditions, asking questions, right? So the listeners who are trying to carry this message and teach these principles, the steps, traditions, and concepts, right? Recovery, unity, service, can hear this and go, oh, okay, I can do that, right? I can open up these books and read these books and talk about these things and ask these questions and teach the people that come to me for help to do that. Because again, if we don't do it with the folks that come to us for help, who's going to teach them? So we're teachers in this fellowship. We're going to pass it along.
Yeah, I think I had read it on the last episode of the podcast that I put out. I can't remember exactly which episode, but we did get an email over the past couple of weeks from a past guest on the podcast that really appreciated what we did with the Tradition Study Part 1. And usually at their home group, they read the tradition of the month and kind of move on and don't really get into it, and was just recognizing how involved the traditions are. And it's really awesome to hear many other addicts talking about this and the importance of this. So the service that all of you guys are doing by jumping here on the podcast and carrying this message to other people listening to the podcast, whether they're in program or in, we do have therapists that listen. We do have partners of addicts that listen, but it opens up a lot to think about, and what keeps our meetings safe and up and running, and just everything that is involved with the traditions. Like I said on the first episode that we did, that I used to think that they were rather dry and not much for me to talk about, but once I start recognizing how important they are, it's really good to be able to convey that message. And just being on here, I learned something new. So I'm really grateful for everyone showing up here.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. I'm having fun. Stay sober, and I look forward to 7, 8, 9, and the next time.
Yeah. So, any closing words from anyone, and then we'll wrap this one up.
No, thanks, Jason. Really enjoyed it.
Awesome.
I do want to make a challenge to the listeners. It's very easy to read the tradition of the month every day in our meeting, right? What are we in March? Third tradition. So every time the March meeting meets, they read the short form of the third tradition. Add to that, read it, but ask someone to make some comments about it, right? Can you take 30 seconds or a minute out of the hour-long meeting to have someone who has some experience to go, hey, in addition to what this says, here's some practical ways that we apply this, or that we might not honor it, or some things to consider, right? So those are little teaching moments that every group can do, and it'll start to cause the people that are in that meeting to pay a little bit more attention. Like, oh, I guess I should pay more attention to that. I didn't realize that. Mm-hmm. So anyway, just one technique.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me. And in a few weeks, whenever we have the time, I am scheduling a lot of different episodes, a lot of different guests coming on. So I will put you in the schedule for the upcoming Tradition Study Part 3. And I really look forward to it. Thank you so much for joining me.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks,
guys.
Jason.
Good night.
Bye. Good night.
Bye, guys.
Many thanks to everyone on this group discussion, and I'm definitely looking forward to the next part of our Traditions Study series. With the Bay Area retreat coming up, I'm quite excited and focused on last-minute details with the committee, so I'll be keeping the episodes fairly simple over the next few weeks. The only bit of feedback that I'll share this week is from the YouTube channel on last week's episode with Tommy, and that was episode number 85. And it says, "This is just what I needed. God bless you, Tommy." And I believe this was referring to Tommy's closing message to the listeners, that you are loved. So beautiful. Anyway, with that, I'm going to close out this episode, and I'm continuing to schedule new recordings over the next few weeks. I've also received links from our quarterly SAA and COSA speaker meeting, of which I'll be sharing one of those very soon. I am also going to be recording a workshop at the Bay Area Retreat, which will be used as an episode of the podcast, so I'm definitely looking forward to that. If you wish to be a guest, part of a panel discussion, or just have general SAA questions, you can email me at jason@sexaddictsrecoverypod.com, or if you wish to leave feedback to be read on the podcast, you can reach us at feedback@sexaddictsrecoverypod.com. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode, and as always, keep coming back. The views and opinions contained in the Sex Addicts Recovery Podcast are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the Bay Area Intergroup or the ISO of SAA.